Dr. Il Sakong, you were the architect, really, of the Seoul summit. I followed it closely myself. I was there as a guest for some of the seminars. How do you see, from the perspective, really, of your experience also in Korea, and by the way, the G20's Leaders Summit in Korea was the first one chaired by one of the non-G7 countries, which was also a major breakthrough. So I give the floor to you now to give us an overview following on this analysis of the world economy.
Thank you very much, Kamal. Let me first begin by commending the IFRI and Thierry Montbrial for initiating the World Policy Conference on Global Governance. The current European development loudly speaks itself how important governance is, not only at the national level, but regional and global community level. There are various ways, I suppose, to characterize today's world, but in terms of the world's economic power constellation, the world is often characterized as not just multipolar, but nonpolar or even G0 world. Consequently, the decision-making at the global decision-making for global affairs is expected to be more difficult, and the process can be protracted. For this reason, again, the governance becomes even more important. The G20 came into being as a new governance in terms of its representativeness, inclusiveness, and so the legitimacy. The G20 certainly stands better than the G7 or G8. The question is, how effective has the G20 been so far, and what needs to be done to strengthen the G20 as a global governance? So I would like to draw your attention on some of these issues this morning. The G20 so far, as a global crisis committee, was generally considered to be successful, since another Great Depression was averted by globally concerted policy actions, primarily led by the G20 during the years 2008 and 2009. So the daunting challenge for the G20 was, and still is, to prove itself as a functioning global steering committee, so to speak, not just as a crisis committee, but steering committee. The Seoul G20 summit, held in November last year, was, in my view, was the first serious test for the G20 as a steering committee. I thought the Seoul G20 summit did not fail, at least, I would say emphasize past, did not fail the test by avoiding another, for example, very severe currency war, and agreeing on a specific timeline for assessing economic imbalances against a set of the indicative guidelines through the mutual assessment process. Then came the Cannes summit just last month. As the summit was held amid the deteriorating the European sovereign debt crisis, G20 as a steering committee had to properly address the crisis. And it did, not to everyone's satisfaction. I personally hope that the G20, in closer cooperation with the IMF, through its more proactively in cooperation with the IMF, would engage more proactively through its mutual assessment process. Obviously, the current G20's mutual assessment process needs to be further formalized and structured with a closer collaborative framework with the IMF's perhaps strengthened surveillance mechanism. I would very much like to see it done under the current Mexican presidency. Obviously, with this, the G20 as a process, I would emphasize a process, not just summits, meetings. The European crisis until the summit scheduled in next June in Mexico should continuously engage in, G20 should engage in the dealing with the European crisis. And then for the effectiveness of the G20, I would emphasize the necessity of strengthening its own governance system and keeping focused, not overextending its own agenda, but focusing on some of the very important priority agenda. In this regard, current Troika system can be better structured and further formalized. In addition, it is very important to keep the Troika as a strong leadership team, and so the chair rotation scheme, in my view, is so critical. Of course, in Cannes, the next chair country was designated to be Russia, and then followed by Turkey. But then I would like to see the rotation scheme is designed in such a way that three Troika can become a very strong team. According to experiences, other international regional forums, which country chairs makes a lot of difference in terms of its outcome. So I would like to see the G20, since G20 does have this Troika system, to make the Troika as a strong team every year.
Could I ask one follow-up question?
Sure.
The relationship between the G20 and the IMF.
Yeah.
You said one or two words on it. Are you happy with it? Should it be? Has it worked well, do you think? Some comments on that, because...
Well, okay, now the G20, the relationship with IMF is rather on an ad hoc basis. I would like to see more structured, the modus operandi should be clearly reestablished. And I would like to see, because G20 doesn't have its own research capability or the supporting capabilities, so it should work closely with existing multilateral institutions, IMF in particular. And in that regard, I would like to see more the clearly defined working relationship. And for mutual assessment process, again, which is very loosely arranged now, should be more formally structured, and then in close collaboration with this IMF surveillance mechanism.
Thank you. I think it's an important issue, and I agree with you.
Right.
Some people say there should be a secretariat of the G20, kind of permanent bureaucracy.
Right.
Maybe a small one, very small.
Yeah.
But
so let me just mention on that. Say for the G20's effectiveness and the continuity as a process, it needs some level of institutionalization. Perhaps before establishing a small-scale secretariat, a cyber secretariat can be introduced by consolidating the existing G20 website run by each presidency. Let me now briefly touch on the relationship between the G7 and G8 and G20. G20 leaders, of course, including G7 leaders in Pittsburgh, agreed to designate the G20 as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. Therefore, the major global financial and economic issues should be brought into the G20 context even for those issues requiring actions to be taken primarily by the G7. What I have in mind here is, for example, exchange rate adjustments among major currencies. The actions need to be taken primarily by G7 countries. But I would like to see this issue bring into the G20's context, and then let G7 take action. In this regard, I was so glad to see the G7 finance ministers in Toronto agreed not to the published communique, but I was not really pleased to see the last time, immediately after the Japanese earthquake, the disaster, G7 or G8 came up with decision to support the yen. I'm not against, I'm not talking about the substance, but the way it was done. I thought first it should be brought into the G20, and then within the G20, G7 should have come out. So
thank you very much.
Okay,
thank you for these points.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.